Friends, I want to talk tonight about religious conflict. And unlike other speeches I've given, I'm not going to give the reason for why I'm talking about this at the start of the speech. It will become clear at the end. Please bear with me. The first conflict that many Americans have studied extensively in our history classes in high school, but most of us don't think about too much anymore, is the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics in Europe. Protestant movement was started by Martin Luther, who made very strong objections to some of the practices of the Catholic Church at the time. One of those practices was the selling of indulgences. An indulgence is like a get out of jail free card for hell. If you did something really bad, normally you would be punished by going to hell in the afterlife. But if you bought an indulgence from the church, then you could get out of doing some time in the bad place. So this is a very legitimate objection by Martin Luther, and that started the Protestant Reformation. There's many events and incidents that I could discuss in this long history. One I wanted to highlight is called the Defenestration of Prague. It's quite dramatic and maybe just a little bit humorous. What happened here is that the residents of Prague were primarily Protestant, but they were part of the Holy Roman Empire, which was Catholic. And there was a lot of disputes and negotiations. And at one point, the emperor, who was Catholic, sent some of his envoys to Prague to give them a bunch of new rules and regulations and strict lectures about what they're not supposed to do. And the citizens of Prague didn't like this, so they took the Catholic envoys and threw them out the window. This led to a lot of unpleasantness afterwards. There's another incident in, again, very long history of this conflict. This is the siege of La Rochelle. La Rochelle was a stronghold of the French Huguenots, who were Protestants, and they were at odds with the King of France, who was a Catholic, and the rest of France, which is primarily Catholic. This painting shows Cardinal Richelieu, the famous advisor to the King Louis XIII, who oversaw the siege. The Huguenots were eventually defeated after a 14-month siege of this city of La Rochelle, and that defeat led to the downfall of Protestantism in France. We now think of France as a Catholic country. This is just a summary of this long history. And two things I think are really remarkable about the story is that some of these wars lasted so long. The 80 Years' War. Think about a war that took 80 years to fight between the Dutch Protestants and the French Catholics. Another important fact is that the death toll was extremely high, especially considering the population of the time. If you adjust for the population sizes, the wars of religion in Europe were actually deadlier than the 20th century wars. Religious conflict is bad. Here's a second conflict I want to discuss briefly. This is between the Sunni and the Shia in Islam. On the left, we see some Shia Muslims performing an Ashura procession. On the right is a gathering of Sunni Muslims in the Al-Azhar Mosque of Cairo. The split between Sunni and Shia is complex, but a key event was the Battle of Karbala. The Sunni side believed that the Prophet Muhammad had not designated a successor, and therefore the Muslim community could choose their own successor based on their own councils. The Shia side believed that Muhammad had designated a successor who was the father of Hussein ibn Ali. And in this battle, Hussein and his small force was killed by the other Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, who followed the elected caliph of the time. And this battle started the split between Sunni and Shia. Another very important conflict in this history was between the Ottoman Empire, which was Sunni, and the Safavid Empire, which was Shia. The Safavid Empire is what is now modern-day Iran. In this battle of Chaldiran, the Ottomans defeated the Safavids decisively, partly because the Ottomans had artillery, and that led to a relative rise in the power of Sunni over the Shia. Now, again, simplifying this history a lot and just picking out some key points here. What's remarkable to me is that this conflict has lasted so long. It started in the early days of the Islamic religion and has continued to this day. The modern wars between Iran and Iraq are basically sectarian conflict between Shia and Sunni. The third conflict I want to get to is between Hindus and Muslims in India. On the left, we see some Muslims celebrating a Hanuman procession. Hanuman is a Hindu deity. And on the right are some Muslims celebrating the Muharram procession. This is a celebration of, or a commemoration of the Battle of Karbala that I mentioned previously. The most dramatic event and the most bloody event in this history was the partition of India. Basically, what happened is that when they were living under the British, the Hindus and the Muslims were happy to work together because they both disliked the British. But after World War II, Britain rather quickly decided to leave India, and they did so in a hasty and disorganized fashion. And as independence approached, the Muslims demanded a separate state, and this was eventually granted, but in an extremely chaotic and disorganized way. Millions of people had to migrate from one side to another to be on the right side of their new boundary, and millions of people were killed in the process. And recently, the violence didn't stop there. It slowed, but there is still a trickle of events in this struggle. In the 90s, there was an incident where a Hindu mob stormed a mosque and demolished it. In the 2000s, there was an event where some Islamic terrorists bombed some trains in Mumbai. A lot of events like this, relatively small scale, but still traumatic. Again, the message here is that this conflict lasts for a long time. Many people are killed, and it continues to create stress and disunity. I want to reflect for a moment on these conflicts. One fact that I see is that they are fractally complex. So every incident in this history has an enormous amount of historical context and backstory and various factors leading up to the incident. And it's also a fool's errand to try to judge right and wrong. So you don't study the wars of religion and conclude that the Protestants were the good guys and the Catholics were corrupt and evil. That's just not the way it works. On the other hand, if you're a French Huguenot living in the city of La Rochelle, then you probably do believe that the Catholics are quite nasty. Now, that brings me to the fourth conflict, which is us, the modern culture war in America between the so-called MAGA right and the woke left. These words are not the perfect words, but I think they get across the idea. There's a lot of traumatic events that have happened recently. Black Lives Matter riots in 2020 was an example. A lot of damage was done. Not many people were killed directly, but it caused a problem with law enforcement that led to a uptick in the homicide rate. The January 6th riots, also very traumatic for a lot of people. Basically, a bunch of Trump supporters broke into the Capitol in the aftermath of the election and caused a lot of mischief. And the Trump assassination attempt in 24 was pretty scary because if that had gone differently, I think that politics in this country would be very, very dark and ugly place right now. So I want to sum up, and I've spoken for too long already, but my message is that we should become serious about peace negotiations in this religious conflict. We should take the other side's perspective seriously. We have to acknowledge each other's sacred values and not dismiss the beliefs of the other side. If we can't do that, we're going to face a long, prolonged, drawn-out conflict that is going to cost us blood, treasure, and bitterness. Thanks very much.